So I'm presenting some work that I've done in collaboration with colleagues in New Zealand at the Waikato Institute of Technology. And I'm really sorry that I've never met Jonathan or Anthea. I was about to go when COVID put an end to that. So I've never met them except on Zoom, but I've had a very, very good time working with them. So what I'm, in order to introduce the subject of the research that we've done together, I need to look at an acronym that I find a bit silly, really. It's playful for about 5 seconds and then it isn't, but it's important to establish this. This stands for people who are from backgrounds that are Western, industrialized, educated, rich and democratic. And we could call them wired, you know, but they're known as weird. And the reason that this is an interesting point that's been raised recently is that it's been estimated, I think these are the authors, that 80% of participants in social and behavioral science research studies are from those backgrounds. And yet, those backgrounds comprise only 12% of the world's population. So they are the sort of people that we've been talking about a lot today in terms of participants that we've been hearing about in the studies presented today are, in this view, an unrepresentative minority of the human race. And they're also, because of their Western industrialized, educated, rich and democratic backgrounds, something like outliers. You know, they are on many scales well beyond and very different from the majority of the human population. So now this was social and behavioral science research studies, but the question has been put quite legitimately that a similar observation could be made for SLA. Who are the participants and where are they from? And are they representative of the human race? And one of the features of people who are not from these Western, industrialized, educated, rich, democratic backgrounds is literacy. And there's a lot been written in the last, say, 10, 15 years about the influence of L1 literacy on second language acquisition. And one of the questions that's been asked is if literacy is an influence on processing linguistic information. And that's a big if, which is why I've got it in italics. And if it's associated with distinct ways of learning second languages, so this is an idea been put forward by Tyrone and colleagues, and also by Havron and Arnon, then can SLA research findings garnered from literate participants, literate in their L1 that is, be assumed to apply to language learners with limited or no literacy in their L1? So that's a really good question, and it's obviously an empirical question, and it obviously points towards doing replications of studies that we take to be very important in telling us important information about second language acquisition. We should do them again, but with a different population, with low literacy participants. And in fact, that's why I'm working with these people in New Zealand. The Journal of Language Learning is in the process of hosting a lot of studies which are being replicated with this thing in mind. You're replacing, they're partial replications, but they are replacing the participant pool with low literacy L1 learners. And this is the one which we are doing. It's a paper published a quarter of a century ago by Peter Skehan and me, which you may or may not have read, but I'm not going to talk too much about it because I want to sort of cut to the chase very quickly with the replication. But this paper was set within the task-based learning and teaching world. It concerned L2 learners transacting, it's the idea that L2 learners in task-based learning, they transact an oral task and can attend to language form incidentally while doing that, rather than deliberately, like in a PPP classroom. And the idea is, and we've heard about this actually earlier, that Skehan's model, limited attention model, means that when learners are transacting a task where they're focused on one element of performance, which might be being accurate, it might be being complex, it might be being fluent, that comes at the cost of them having insufficient attentional resources to pay attention to other dimensions of their performance. And that therefore pre-task planning time manages to increase your attentional capacity because it reduces the demands of having to attend to form and content, and allows oral performance to be more accurate and or more complex and or more fluent in the L2. That was the idea, and that's what we did. And this was the design of the 1996 study. We had 3 tasks which presented graded levels of cognitive demands, from the least demanding to the most demanding. That is, a personal information exchange was considered to be the least cognitively demanding, a picture narrative was more so cognitively demanding, and the most cognitively demanding was a decision-making task that required you to use your powers of reasoning and argument. There were 3 planning conditions. There were learners who were given no planning time, learners who were given 10 minutes of undetailed planning time, and another group that were given 10 minutes with advice on how to plan before the task started. There were 3 performance dimensions, which were what I've said, the classic accuracy, complexity, fluency. There were 32 participants, and they were garnered from conveniently intact EFL classes at lower intermediate level. And incidentally, 25 years later, I'm thinking they were all high-level L1 literacy, although we didn't care about that at the time. In brief, Peter and I found very significant effects of planning on fluency, that giving planning time allowed the learners to do those tasks much more fluently. There were significant effects also on complexity of the language that they used to talk about the concepts of the task, such that the detailed planning gave you more complexity than the undetailed planning, which gave you more complexity than the no planning. There were less clear-cut effects on accuracy. This was kind of the other way around, strangely, that the undetailed planning time gave you more accuracy than the detailed planning time, which gave you more accuracy than the no planning. And there was an interaction between task type and planning on all performance dimensions. That is to say, the narrative and decision-making tasks were more accurate, more fluent, and more complex than the personal information exchange task when there was planning given. And we then, back then, wrote about a trade-off between the competing goals of complexity and accuracy, as I said, in the context of having to prioritize your attentional resources. So here we are doing a partial replication of this now. We have 3 tasks which are the same, all right, except that, I'll tell you about it in a minute, we couldn't use exactly the same because time has moved on. I'll tell you about that in a minute. We have 2 planning conditions, only planning and non-planning, and undetailed planning to make things easier for ourselves. We have 3 performance dimensions as before: accuracy, complexity, fluency. We have 45 participants this time, recruited from former refugee communities in Hamilton, New Zealand, who were attending English as an additional language classes, and they were at sort of CEFR B1, a bit of B2 as well. So they were consistent with the earlier learners. They all took a literacy test in their L1, and they all came out as having very low level or no literacy in their L1. So the differences from the original study were inevitable, but they were minor. We had to adjust the task to suit the participant profile. We couldn't really involve the task of, deciding how long to send to prison a woman who had murdered her husband after she had found him in bed with another woman, because it would have been difficult to get that past the ethics committee. It was probably outraged a few people there. We couldn't have done it in a counterbalanced order. That just turned out to be impossible. There was only one planning condition, as I've said. And yes, we screened them for literacy. And we also employed another measure of accuracy, because we've got a better measure, I would say, now than we had 25 years ago. The hypotheses are, and I'm racing through this, 5, that the planned performance would be characterized by greater fluency and greater complexity and greater variability, but not greater accuracy. And the effects of planning will be greatest on the task with the heaviest cognitive load and least on the task with the lightest cognitive load. So it'll be more on that decision-making task. But the decision-making task was having to decide how long to punish someone in prison or who'd done some kind of crime, which you could see as very serious, or you could see as nothing at all, depending on your opinion. So there's a lot of reasoning that had to go on there. And this is what we are basically, again, the performance dimensions and measures for these 3 things were, error-free clause ratio, weighted clause ratio, index of subordination, index of variety. There were various measures to pick up repair fluency, such as replacements, reformulations, starts, and breakdown, which is largely pausing and silence. So now with the analyses, I realized as I was writing these slides for you, this could go on a very long time. So I'm giving you almost no details of them because I want to get to the results really. But I've prepared the slides for them if you want later. We did 2-way mixed ANOVAs. The independent variables were task type, which is within participants, and planning condition, which is between participants. We and in the what I'm going to show you, you need to know that when I talk about task 1, that's the easy one, the personal information exchange. When I talk about task 2, that's the decision-making task, that's the most difficult. And when I talk about task 3, that's the narrative, which is sitting in the middle. This was the order they were done in: task 1, task 2, task 3. There you are, if you really want the slides with lots of numbers. I've got them. But what you really want me to talk about, I think, is what we found. Right? So this is a replication of a study done 25 years ago, which is very, very close, except for this one thing. These learners are not literate, or they have very low literacy in their L1. Will this mean that they perform differently because they have different habits of mind? The argument goes that they have less access to explicit meta language that they could possibly draw on during planning time, but they haven't got that. They haven't got that habit of thinking about language in that explicit way. They don't have a habit. The argument would go that they have less ability to think of language in the abstract. Now, I'm completely agnostic about this. So I was just really interested to see what would happen. And I hope you're all sitting there thinking, oh, I'm guessing that this is what was going to happen. And so now I'm going to tell you. So the first hypothesis.
Could we bet?
Yes. Open a book.
We write somewhere down.
Open a book. Right, do it now. What do you think? What do you think? Yeah, show me later. Plan performance will be characterized by greater fluency. Is the hypothesis. Did the ANOVAs, and then don't, and the outcome was not upheld. All right, not upheld. In terms of repair fluency, there was no significant difference between the planned and unplanned condition. In terms of breakdown fluency, no significant difference between the planned and unplanned condition. And mean scores were actually in the opposite direction to that hypothesis. They actually went the other way. And I've got them somewhere. I can show them to you if you want to. In terms of proportion of silence to time on task, there was no significant difference between planned and unplanned condition. And again, the mean scores of the amount of time they spent not saying anything at all was in the opposite direction to the hypothesis. All right, so big surprise. Don't know if you've won your bet with yourself. H2. Planned performance will be characterized by a greater complexity of expression as measured by the number of clauses per AS unit. So this is an index of how much syntactic packing they can put into one AS unit. All right, not upheld. No statistically significant effect for planning on syntactic complexity. And that's all I have to say about that. It just didn't happen. I only measured it one way. But the next one, H3, is syntactic variety. That is to say, greater variability in the plan condition in the use of tenses, aspect, modality, and voice. So there's just more going on. They're sort of using more of the English language possibilities here. Not upheld. Not upheld. The statistically significant result was in the opposite direction to the hypothesis. Right? So they were less varied if they planned. They went the other way. H4, planned performance will not be associated with any increase in accuracy. Now this was saying it won't increase because there has been very mixed effects for accuracy as a result of planning time. It's difficult to pick up, it's inconclusive, or it's sort of vaguely yes and vaguely no. So we just went down with there won't be any effect for accuracy. And that was upheld just because I think we decided to phrase it that way.
Clever.
Very clever. No significant effect for planning on either accuracy measure. So we did two. We did the weighted clause ratio and the error-free clauses. Error-free clauses were done in the original study. Nothing going on there. The weighted clause ratio mean scores across all the tasks, however, were in the opposite direction. If they planned, they had mean scores on all those tasks that were less accurate, but this did not reach significance. At H5, the effects of planning will be greatest on the tasks with the heaviest cognitive load and the least on the tasks with the lightest cognitive load. Well, as you know, we really didn't have much in the way of effects for planning, but it wasn't upheld. All right. No significant interaction was found between planning and task type on any of the performance variables investigated in the previous 4 hypotheses. Oops, sorry, this button is very sensitive. But there was a consistent and highly significant effect for task type, with performances on the cognitively least demanding task, the personal information exchange, tending to lead to the most accurate, least syntactically complex, least syntactically varied, and most fluent performance. So, where does this leave us? There's little in the way of statistically significant effects, as you've seen, which so many of the results are pointing us in the opposite direction to the 1996 paper that I think it's worth taking that as a serious signpost for something. So it's possible to suggest that planning time led these low literacy L1 users of English to be more hesitant and less ambitious in what they decided to say in the performance of the task, right? It took the wind out of their sails, and it made them possibly more accurate as well. Is planning time therefore an inhibiting factor? Or is it creating space for reflection on performance, which they're actually using in a positive manner, even though it's taking the wind out of their sails? They're sailing too fast in the wrong direction, possibly, so that it's a good thing to take the wind out of their sails. So in line with H4, there was no effect for planning on accuracy. And H4 was the way it was because partly these low literacy language learners have been said to have little access to meta language, little habit of reflecting consciously on grammar, so not able to draw on those things during planning time, which L1 literate learners are able to do. And as I've said, that's not the story from the mean scores. They're all going the other direction, suggesting somehow, somewhere, in a mild way, they are accessing some knowledge which is allowing them to be more accurate, even if that did not reach statistical significance. So that planning time is providing extra attentional space, and the speaker opts for less varied and less fluent performance and accesses that knowledge at the back of their mind, they can be more accurate. So the task effects, and basically the p-values were all about less than 0.001 in terms of how the task impacts on performance. That is the main thing. So task 1 is significantly different from performance on task 2 and 3 in terms of error-free clauses, weighted clause ratio, syntactic complexity, syntactic variety, breakdown fluency, proportion of silence. But no significant difference really between tasks 2 and 3, except for this random couple of things, weighted clause ratios for one and clause boundary pausing for another. I'm not talking about clause boundary pausing. It's very interesting, and we've heard about it today, but I don't have time. I'll just come back and tell you about that. So the pattern of results indicates that these low L1 literacy learners, regardless of whether they have time to plan or not, their oral task performance is influenced by mostly the familiarity of the information they're given to talk about and the amount of cognitive work they have to do when processing it. That's the key. They can, if they need to, formulate syntactically more complex language in response to the more complex demands of task 2 and 3. But it's both the planners and the non-planners. Planning really wasn't involved in that. It was just the demand of the task to spin a narrative or to explain a judgment. That's what was prompting it. So my final point, it comes back to, do we explain this very big difference between these studies, between the original and replication, in terms of low-level L1 literacy? Is that it? And I think it's possibly it, but it's very clear from looking at who these learners were in New Zealand that they were really very different from the ones in London in the original study in lots of different ways, including their motivation, ultimate language learning goals, and background. So the original study participants were definitely weird. They were very Western, from industrial, educated, rich, developed countries. But, and if you look at them, they were aged between 18 and 30. They were temporary visitors to the UK. They were coming to get Cambridge First Certificate. Then they were going home again. They used English in their daily lives for shopping and casual conversations on buses or asking people the way to the post office. They didn't have to use English in order to negotiate with the local authorities or the the immigration offices or anything like that. They didn't need it for that, anything with high stakes, and they didn't need or have paid employment because they didn't need to earn. They just come with their money already to do these first certificates in London. Whereas in New Zealand, they were older. I don't have time to talk about how difficult it was during COVID and with these populations of people who had been refugees to recruit them. It was difficult. We recruited them. They tend to be older. They were settled permanently in New Zealand. They were not going back to their countries of origin. Their bridges were burned. They were going to spend the rest of their lives probably in New Zealand because they'd fled from war or situations of violent conflict. They had experienced, many of them, terrible trauma. They'd spent time in refugee camps. They were facing the rest of their lives needing to integrate as far as possible into New Zealand society, earn their living, right, in every way. They had to be competent in English. They had to be able to negotiate housing, health, employment, their children's education, their immigration status, their tax problems, all sorts of social obligations in English. What I haven't mentioned is what their language backgrounds were. Lots were from Afghanistan. So they had Pashto, or I wrote it down because I thought, oh, someone's going to ask me about that. Dari. There were quite a lot of people with Arabic from Iraq or from Syria. There was a couple of people whose first language was Mandarin, Kurdish, Urdu. So anyway, English was their essential tool. So what I've called personal urgency was operating in these people that was not operating in the original study. And the personal urgency of having to build your life again with another language might dispose someone to dispense with grammatical elements that are semantically redundant and or phonologically indistinct. Typically verb morphology counts as errors. But it might not be because you're not able to respond to meta language that says there's a morpheme on the end of this, or to be able to read it comfortably on the page that says, don't forget to put ed on the end and highlight it in red or anything like that. If it's semantically redundant and phonologically indistinct, your idea might be, don't bother with it then. I've got more important things to do. That would not arise from the cognitive habits of a non-literate L1 background, and it wouldn't have anything to do with inability to deal with language, with meta-language. But it's a sensible choice not to expend precious time and effort on something which doesn't give you any real extra communicative effectiveness. And that might account for why in the unplanned condition, there was a suggestion that these participants were actually prioritizing fluency over accuracy. And in the planned condition, when they were made to wait for 10 minutes before they could get going on the task, how they were just, the anecdotal evidence and the research assistants were, they just wanted to get on with it. They just wanted to talk to each other. They didn't want to fuss around thinking about what to say. So they were anxious to get going. So I know I've probably gone beyond my time, but I'm just going to tell you, as you're a captive audience, and I don't have anyone coming behind me, after me, this was another major problem with the replication, which was in the original study, there were worksheets, and the people in the no planning condition were basically told, turn over your worksheet, start the task. There's really no planning. But it was written down. What they had to do was written down. Because these people had literacy issues, they weren't very good. They couldn't read their first language, and they weren't that good at reading English. It was decided that rather than have them struggle with the written instructions, everybody would get an oral introduction to the task, including what the narrative pictures were and including the details of the criminal cases. So the non-planning condition had to happen, like contain an element of planning, which was absent in the original study, and it may have affected what these people needed to think about because we'd given them information already. So I'm not sure about that, but if we were going to do it again, I think we should. I think we definitely have them, but there should be stricter operationalization of pre-task planning. Just don't give them anything, right? Just see how they deal with turning over a worksheet and getting on with it. There needs to be a narrower age range of participants, although it's so hard to recruit people. It's easy to recruit EFL learners in London that you fall over them. This is the old days, of course, perhaps less so now, but there were hundreds of them around for me to recruit from. It's much more difficult to recruit from the ex-refugee community. It would be good to have a questionnaire on their motivation. What do they want out of these classes? What are they aiming to be? What kind of language user do they want to be? Do they really think that being accurate and being complex is important, or do they just want to be fluent so that they don't waste people's time who are listening to them? I would think it'd be also good to get, or always think this, an equivalent L1 performance to see what they're like when they're using a language that they are comfortable in. So ultimately, going back to the first question, and I will let you all go now, we do need to know if SLA theory and the implementation of task-based language teaching needs to be adjusted to accommodate different types of language learning. And one of those different types of language learning might be affected by literacy in your L1 or not. That's my references. And I want a big shout out to people in the WinTech staff who did the data collection and the transcription and the coding, a lot of it. So when you applaud me, you're also applauding them. Thank you, everybody.